Hi, welcome to Growing the Edge, the show about transformation. So tonight's episode, or today's episode, depending on where you are, is all about trust. But do we really know what the anatomy of trust actually is? Is it to do with the head or the heart? Maybe is trust a right or a privilege, or is it even a transaction, or even a let me see? Yeah, that sort of thing. So what we've got is some experts to discuss this with, and really I've done my false dichotomy. So after that, let's go with Tim Williams, and maybe you can tell us, Tim, a little bit about your take on trust.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Chris. I'm delighted to be part of this wonderful community here. So I've got a bit of an odd angle that I'm going to take because you've put me first. I was going to talk about something different, but I'm going to change track. And I'm actually going to tell a story, because I think a story is a really nice way of opening up a dialogue, opening up a conversation. Now, this is a family story. It's a family history story. And the key date in this story is the 1st of April, 1873. This was the date when a liner, an Atlantic liner owned by, I think, White Star Lines, called the Atlantic, was crossing the Atlantic. And just like a successor to the Atlantic, Titanic, also owned by the same star, it hit an iceberg. Now, one of my ancestors was on this ship, and my ancestor, whose name was Charles W. Allen, had the good sense. He was very fortunate. He's a privileged guy. He was in a cabin or up the top, but he had the good sense to grab his greatcoat and his boots and climb the rigging, because he'd heard that if you climbed the rigging, there was a good chance that you could stay above the water. You could stay, dry, not wet, until he was rescued. And he was indeed rescued by brave Newfoundlanders rowing out in boats. And I think he was in the sixth boat, but he was one of the survivors. I think, about, roughly speaking, of 700 people on the ship, about 300 survived. All the women and children, I think, died. But basically, he was one of the survivors, and 400 people went down. Now, the reason I'm talking about this particular incident is because underneath this story, there's a deep root cause analysis to be done around trust. Now, I say I wouldn't exist if this guy hadn't had the presence of mind. My family wouldn't exist. But when we dig into the root cause analysis, and you can look it up on Wikipedia, the guy who was in charge of the coal on that ship didn't trust the captain to tell him how much coal was on the ship, and he was keeping back. He was keeping back a stealthy reserve of coal in the belief that that was going to make them safe. However, that secret reserve of coal that he kept back meant that the captain thought that they didn't have enough coal to get to their destination, and that therefore they needed to divert to Halifax. So off the back of one guy's lack of trust in another person made a trust decision, and the calamity came about because the captain trusted he went to bed at midnight trusting some underlings who were undertrained and who weren't familiar, who'd never been to Halifax before, to look out for lightships and lighthouses and to navigate. But they'd never actually done this navigation before. None of the people on the ship were actually trained, and so the captain was trusting people who weren't worthy of trust. He went to sleep. They hit an iceberg. The incident happened. But that story has got a whole thing about personality trust, untrusting personalities, people overly trusting, and ultimately like a catalogue of error around trust, all in that little story. So I thought that would be a nice way of starting this conversation, because it's a story, we can all relate to it, and it's got a lot of different dimensions to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good story. I mean, what I like about it is that everybody's making slightly different assumptions about what's going on in your story, aren't they, Tim?
Yeah.
So that's
my start of a conversation, you know.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Funnily enough, I think one of my mother's uncles may have been on the Titanic. I don't have the details, and may have been a survivor, but I need to look into that in more details. I'm from Southampton. Both my families are from Southampton, so I've got seafaring blood But and I'm sure that trust is and seafaring stories probably go together, don't they? Because there's quite a lot of risk involved in that type of activity. So I suppose what we're talking about, what you've described, is a situation that is not agreed amongst the participants. They've all got different mental models.
Certainly, and yeah, I think it's quite fascinating. I mean, if we look at Titanic, there were issues there with trust around the belief amongst the people who had conceived of it that everything was going to be riveted, but then the people who actually had to do the riveting and actually do the riveting right in the corner, where it was impossible to get there, realized they had to compromise and they couldn't get the steel hammer into that corner, and it was going to be a person hammering that steel in the critical corner. And so there were different assumptions about what was possible, and then everybody ultimately was collectively trusting the Titanic designers, trusting that there were the right amount of lifeboats on the Titanic, and some of them weren't going to be removed for cosmetic reasons. Actually, I've got another little story about ships. It's just come to mind.
Okay.
It was told to me by somebody who'd worked on a US government classified program, and it was about the design of the Zumwalt, the American ship. And there were a couple of little stories around it. This chap's gone into retirement, so I think I can quite safely relay the key bits of the story. But one was around the fact that because it was going to have no radar signature, unless it wanted to have a radar signature, projected radar signature, they had a real problem with the ropes, because a typical ship would have something you can tie the ropes onto. So very late in the project, they realized, we're going to need a special hole that the ropes could disappear into. And so about $25 million was spent on the design of a special shape of the hole. But that was one little story. But another one was about the launch. So because again it was a smooth surfaces ship, you weren't going to be able to have people with railings standing on the deck. So there's the whole thing of how can we do a launch of a ship with no people standing on it? So anyway, I just thought I'd throw this in.
I mean, this reminds me of a couple of things actually. The first thing is I've got a book and I don't remember the title. In fact, I gave it to Karthik. Do you remember Karthik?
I do. Yeah.
So I need to get another copy. And it was it's Why Buildings Fall Down. So it's by an Italian guy,
yeah.
and it's quite well known. I think we've discussed it before, haven't we? So the idea is it talks about why buildings fall down. There's a famous building which was a walkway in a hotel, and it was multiple tiered. Yeah. And the architect had designed it with the steel rods going all the way through all three decks of the walkways. And for some reason, that didn't cut it when they came to building it. So what they did is they cut it, and they had three separate rods, and they were kind of at a bit of an angle. And of course, the shearing force meant it just the metal fatigue, it just bent and it fell over, and either people were killed or injured. But it was basically the architect's design was fine. And
actually, you could think about Grenfell. Sorry, yeah. You just made me think of Grenfell. So Grenfell was fascinating. Yeah. I mean, it's still ongoing inquiry with Grenfell, but in that situation, the architects had an idea of compartmentalizing it, but that knowledge of the original concept was lost over time, and then the people associated with planning the cladding were perceiving that the decision was about look, and you could see on the London Borough of Kensington Chelsea website the correspondence. Is it okay if we change the colour of the cladding? I'll ring you up with the 50 quid by the credit card for the change, and that's the level at which the decision making
which then gets us into Parkinson's law of triviality and bike shedding, doesn't it? That actually, if we're talking about risk, we're talking about expertise, we're talking about specialism. People don't necessarily want to talk about specialism. They have an opinion on things, and what happens is that generalizes it, and it means the people who do understand risk, and maybe their voices can be lost in the noise, can't they? I'm wondering if we want to bring in anybody else. So Ben C is saying assumptions versus beliefs versus trust versus having confidence in. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things around that we've been discussing. I'm wondering if anybody has any thoughts on what Tim shared so far.
I think it's interesting, Tim, what you're saying about your great grandfather. Was it?
Yeah, it's probably great. I think. I think my grandfather's grandfather. I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think your family member obviously had initiative to do what he did. So whilst you have a level of trust, you also have a level of initiative. But if you're constantly in fear and dread, where are you going to access that creativity and initiative from?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And actually, you're thinking about that situation. There would be justifiable reasons why everybody on that ship would have behaved differently. So the crew members who were supposed to be trained and were supposed to help getting people on their lifeboats hadn't actually been trained, and so they didn't respond to the captain's orders, and they were behaving in fear of their lives, quite rationally. And the people who kind of hid didn't come up from below deck, they would have had their reasons for feeling like, well, we're safer where we are because I don't really know I've never been up on deck before, so everybody would have had their own viewpoints in that situation. And I wasn't really trying to say there was one voice or one answer, but what I was trying to say is that the issue of trust is very intertwined, people to people. Absolutely. People to material objects to people. I mean, ultimately my ancestor was rescued because a combination of people, brave Newfoundlanders on the shore, and a small rowing boat were sufficient, knowing that area to rescue him and many of the other people who were rescued. So little things can make a huge difference in a trust, even in high crisis situations.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
There's a story. Well, it's not a story, but it's actually real. Where during 9/11, it's actually about a particular lady. I think her name was Maria. I'm not sure about her actual name, but the story or the situation went that she didn't follow what her colleagues were doing, which was staying at their desk. She went down and left the tower, whereas some people went back to get their children's photos or their belongings, and then they didn't get out. So that whole kind of being intertwined behavior, initiative, there's a lot there to be said about following your gut instinct and your initiative and your kind of modus of operandi. Is that how you say it? So your kind of way that you do things.
Yeah. Well, maybe also culture, because if you think that my ancestor had some kind of cultural understanding that there was a procedure, climb the rigging and you'll be safe. He was probably a privileged, educated person. He had that. Oh. If you think about Grenfell, there would have been people who had enough knowledge from culture to know the fact that, I'm not going to be safe where I am because they've just put cladding in and we've been protesting about it. I need to get out. And there would have been other people looking at the signs and just trusting the signs, saying stay in your room, or bring up the fire brigade and the fire brigade following. So effectively, to override the signals that are telling you to trust one thing, you need to have knowledge and culture that gives you the ability to do that. And then obviously Sullenberger with his the Hudson River thing, he was a specialist in aviation safety incidents. So when he realized he was having a bird strike and he needed to bring the plane down, he went into his trained mode. He went into, he knew what to do, and he had the decency to stay on the plane until the last person was off. And, so there's a real case for developing cultures of expertise around how to behave particularly in high complexity scenarios. So David Snowden's research around complexity, effectively more and more people need to have training in how to handle complexity. Was it probe, sense, decide? So effectively, more people need to know about how to make decisions in complex environments. How many people really get that training from their education? How do we engender that type of ability to make good trust decisions?
So this might be a really good segue into talking to Ben next, because we've started to talk about high risk situations and jeopardy and risk management and complexity. And Ben, you have an interesting background. I think, were you in the Marines? Am I correct? And presumably those topics are very, very relevant. So, how does trust translate into your experience?
Yeah, very good segue. I was just going to make an observation about Tim's ancestor, that in fact the only reason that he'd probably been considering the wife scenario is because he maybe didn't have quite as much trust in the system as other people. So, why would you be thinking about climbing the rigging unless you thought you might have to climb the rigging? So, there's multiple different ways to kind of slice this. So, my background in the military, the military is fairly unique, or fairly different along one major axis, is that compared to civilian organizations, we have this very, very long onboarding process that we call basic training. And that the whole point of basic training is to instill trust. I didn't really understand it at the time, but all of those 5 a.m. press ups were really about instilling trust, because trust is the foundational quality upon which you can build group intuition, right? Unless you have trust amongst your group, amongst your team, you're not going to have the bond with which you then build that kind of group flow, group intuition. And all of the things we were talking about the lack of training on that crew, well, you don't have any common basis there. So there's no intuition that the captain would have had that maybe I'm probably going a little bit too fast, but so the captain gives command of the ship to the crew. The crew aren't trained or don't have the knowledge that the captain has, therefore the ship crashes. Well, where did the trust break down, right? There's a certain amount of systemization that happens in the military, so that in the military, in today's world, you have trust that is a certain part of the trust is implicit in the system, i.e. you have the quality control of people coming into the system, you have the orders process, the debrief process, that means that people have this kind of shared understanding of what's going on.
Is there also the need for jeopardy, the pressure on the system? Does it only really come out and into play once there's something a bit gnarly going on? Is that part of what's happening, that actually we can't build trust when everything's just fine and we haven't really got into the gnarly stuff yet?
Yes, I think there's a bit to that. So I think you have to have a forcing function of some kind. I think even to get into individual flow, the research says that you have to have some kind of pressure or some kind of challenge. If it's too easy, you're not going to get into flow. Yeah. And from a lot of the research I've read about high performing teams, you don't get that kind of flow without a bit of pressure as well.
If I can just chip in here, I think, Chris, the idea you're touching on is effectively moral hazard, about whether people make different decisions when they're exposed to risks from when they're not exposed to risk. And a classic example is something like insurance, where the argument will be that somebody who's got insurance behaves in a more risky way than somebody without insurance. I mean, I think there's a very interesting thing just generically, as the world becomes more risky, whether it's COVID or whatever going on out there, and we're stuck in our homes, not necessarily directly exposed to the risks, have we got the resources, whether mental or intellectual, emotional, to put ourselves into the position we would be if we were exposed to the risks, and maybe when we don't make very good decisions because we're so separated from risk. So I'm just throwing that out there as a sort of another dimension on this.
I mean, that is a very good observation. The trope of people who wear bike helmets are more likely to have an accident because they're less attentive, perhaps because they've got some kind of protection. There's certainly a bit to that, I think.
Years ago, there was a Bernard Levin sort of opinion piece in one of the papers that said that to improve road safety, every car should have to have a 9-inch spike fitted to the middle of the steering wheel. This would have far more effect on road safety than airbags and other safety measures.
So does that mean maybe that our safety culture is eroding trust because people are not being exposed to risk and jeopardy to the same level that they used to be? Could that be the secret problem? It's the health and safety crew. I don't blame people. Like, I'm sure there's lots of, I like wearing my cycle helmet, but presumably if we need to learn it in a hazardous environment and we're not being exposed to hazardous environments, then that's maybe an angle, isn't it?
Well, I guess different types of hazard, right? I mean, in a business, one of my favorite books on the whole kind of dynamic explaining how all this stuff works in the military is Team of Teams. And I've met multiple people that served with McChrystal in the special forces in Iraq, and they all point out that this massive forcing function of basically losing a war and getting their asses kicked was a huge building block to making the Team of Teams journey successful. But in the book itself, McChrystal or one of his co-authors makes the point that this might not be life and death in a civilian kind of company context, but people have jobs, people have livelihoods, and when leaders screw up in a civilian context, there are material risks. It's just that perhaps they're slightly less visceral and maybe a few steps removed, which takes away some of that overt forcing function, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me also of the situation in Entebbe Airport, which I think the special forces were able to release a number of hostages very successfully by actually training on the jeopardy, by having a simulation of the airport, like something like a quarter scale model that they trained on. So it's almost like that teamwork, trust. If trust is about teamwork and teamwork is about courage under fire, then that means we have to create those courage under fire. We can't just demand it. We almost have to create that. It feels like it's part of that ingredient. If we're cooking a trust cake, you'd need some jeopardy in the mixing bowl, presumably.
Yeah, just one thing on that. That's a really interesting point. So the way special forces and other elite units train for things like a hostage rescue is to build intuition. So that what you need to do is, if anyone's familiar with Boyd's OODA loop, there's this line called implicit guidance and control from your orientation to your action. And the goal of training in the very same context with exactly the same inputs is that you get to build those implicit guidance and control mechanisms so that, when you're getting on the plane, you're not going, Bob, are you going to go left or are you going to go right? It's muscle memory, completely overwhelming momentum, and that's all built through intuition, and the intuition can't exist without trust.
So does that mean, Ben, that if I got it right, is trust group implicit guidance and control, intuition and guidance and control? Is that what it is, in a sense?
It's the building block, because without the trust, you're never going to get that fluidity. But intuition is built through practice and through repetition. Much like it would be for any skill. Like, I like to ride my motorbike on track, and you can guarantee that I'm not thinking about how much should I close the throttle so that I don't fall off in the mid corner. That's intuition and muscle memory that some people have better than others.
And do you have a spike or a helmet?
Yeah. So we're talking here, I suppose, Ben, about trust being necessary but not sufficient, for that type of scenario. Could we bring in some other voices?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind. I think Dave had a question, and some other voices, and also Valerie Freitas has got a question. So we'll go for Val first, because I've already been told off for not focusing on our lovely audience. So Val is asking, are tight deadlines and vulnerable funding enough? Anybody can answer that. I suppose, Val, you're saying that I guess
to be forcing functions to create trust.
Yeah, indeed, yeah.
I would say yes, they possibly are. There are situations not only in, let's say, the armed forces or fire brigade or rescue services, but there are examples where, for instance, we trust in entities that are too big to fail, or that provide a service that is necessary to us. So, for instance, we believe and trust in the certificate providers for our browsers and internet provision. We without them, we wouldn't be able to do what we do. But we don't really have oversight of them. We don't have insight into what they do, and we don't really know a lot about them. But there's a necessity there as well. So, yeah, tight deadlines and vulnerable funding might be a necessity for my organisation, and therefore would mimic the same situation as peril, shall we say?
Yeah, and then Alex has just mentioned, Alex Papworth, or is it security breaches? So presumably that's another type of peril, isn't it?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Because I'm from a cybersecurity background as well, so I will certainly agree that that is the case. Yes.
Yeah. There's also something from Ben C. Are we mixing up trust with confidence?
I don't think so. I think trust is something that you have by virtue of a process. So if you take the chrysalis, the chrysalis trusts its process. Otherwise, it would never succeed. It would never transform. So I think, some things, yes, probably you need confidence, but in other things, you trust that process, you trust that instinct, you trust that, you are capable of delivering something, whether it's, whatever it is.
Or so what you're saying, Mandy, is the caterpillar knows what to expect?
Not even knows what to expect, because I remember when I had my first baby, I didn't know what to expect and I was absolutely bricking it. But you have the trust within your natural process, instinct, you call it intuition. I don't believe it's confidence, because I know going into the hospital, I didn't have the confidence, but I did trust the natural process.
So that then relates to some extent to Dave Snowden's point from last episode, where he was talking about trust is or hope is different from optimism. Yeah, I think it was something like that, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Terry Eagleton. I'm just wondering, Dave, did you want to come in? I think you were going to say something.
I was curious about Ben's statement, because and he did explain it a little bit further, but this notion that a highly trained group exercises a form of trust that exerts a field beyond the individual. So you train as a unit to trust one another. You might be trustworthy, but as a field, it seems you were saying a highly trained team exerts a field of intuition in order to respond to hazard or danger. That's what you seem to be expressing there to me.
Luke.
Yeah, go ahead, Luke.
I just wanted to add two things. The title of the show is Anatomy of Trust, and I just wanted to add to that. It seems, first of all, it seems to me there's trust is actually not that complicated, right? So it's basically believing in something which transcends yourself and acting according to that value, and that can be a basis then for infusing relationships with trust. That's my hypothesis anyway. And our problem seems to be more about, well, why does it break down? Why does it break down constantly? What's up with corruption? And the second point I wanted to make is maybe that field which you're talking about is more like a liminal field, which can open up if there's enough trust, because you have the same field opening up in theater productions, for example, acting, right? where people don't act rationally anymore or start thinking about every decision, but start to work as a team based more on muscle memory, based more on intuition. So they enter into that liminal field where all their decisions already are prefabricated, so to speak, before they're externalized, and they can draw from that. And I think that's very, very interesting, what you said, Ben, that actually you need trust to enter into that field, be it individually or collectively. So thanks for that.
Yeah, so we got a new game this week because I couldn't use my Brian Eno Peter Smith oblique strategies card. So the trigger word was, of course, liminal. So Luke, I'm going to draw a card for you. And the card is this. Take away the elements in order of apparent non-importance. There we go. I don't know what that means, but there we go. At least I got my gimmick in. But yeah, so I suppose for anybody, so I'm fairly new to the word liminal, and liminal is about rites of passage and things that are between one thing and another. So being a teenager is a liminal time in our life. You know, we're a child at one end and then we're an adult at the other, and we're something in between. And there are various rites of passage, whether it's first kiss or first drink or whatever it might be. So those exams, all of that stuff is kind of, you know, we're in transition from one thing to another. And I suppose in a team perspective, then we're in transition from a team that doesn't have that group behavioral dynamic you're describing, Ben, and then a team that does, through a type of it doesn't, you don't just say we need to act in this way. It's basically spooled up and bootstrapped, isn't it?
Transition is a really good word for that, actually, because I think that there are a lot of similarities between sort of, you know, phase transitions from physics. But it's not a smooth scale, right? You're either in a state of flow or you're not, and it happens really, really quickly. And I think it's the same when you're creating or anything else, right? That transition from thinking through what you're going to do next to the implicit guidance and control loop of group flow and intuition happens instantly. It's like water turning into ice.
Yeah, I mean it's pretty fascinating. I mean I've experienced flow sometimes in my life, in my professional career, and it's pretty cool when it happens. You know, when it happens, don't you? It's like, wow, that was pretty cool. And it's not down in a team context. It's then not down to an individual anymore. It's like there's something greater than me as an individual, and that's pretty exciting. So I'm wondering if we can maybe go on to Caroline now and hear a bit from you about your views on trust and the anatomy of it.
As you all know, I've got very few views on trust. I guess my position on trust is, as a human being, but also when I started to think about trust, I started to think about the roles that I play professionally. So given that I'm a consultant and I'm a coach, and one might argue a trusted advisor on occasion, I have to be trusted and I have to engender that trust instantly. And there's ways that we know that happens. And so my kind of piece for today is really looking at how we trust ourselves, how we engender that trust in others, but how we demand that as organisations and whether that's fair to do or not, particularly in what is becoming a more volatile and uncertain world, both within the organisation and external of it. So when you think about trust and you think about that comes from the senses, so immediately we know that actually if we like the look of somebody, we're more likely to trust them, and we know that's all in the eyes and the mouth and the way that they're positioned, because we know that people that look at visual representations can pick people out that they would trust really quickly. We also know that it's something to do with what you're wearing and whether you look credible or whether you look authentic, and whether or not people are buying into that, and what they're hearing and whether they're listening and what they're listening to in terms of your reputation. But also just in terms of what you're saying and how that's coming across. So we're developing this trust very, very quickly. And for my job, I have to go in and make a lot of assumptions really quickly, which means that the only way I can engender trust is if somebody thinks I'm credible and they get my experience and they believe in that, either by what they've heard or by what I'm saying and what I'm portraying to them. But there's a deeper part of that, which is around my emotional connection to the task or to the company or to the brand or to the job itself. So when I am working as a consultant or as a coach, I have to care in order to emotionally connect. There's no point in me taking on an assignment that I'm not emotionally invested in, because I won't have the follow through to ensure that I've got some integrity and some skin in the game, what I'm doing. And so for me, those are the three core elements of what I do. And in order to do that, I have to trust myself. And what I think is really interesting is organisations are asking leaders to be trusted and trustworthy, when quite often we don't trust ourselves and we don't know what that looks like to others. So what we know about trust is that it's perception, it's based on aligned values. We know that some of the most highly commended, trusted leaders are people like Hitler, for example. So I think Hitler in the scheme of things is number 17th as the most globally trusted leader. And the reason he was able to engender that trust was because his values that he wrote in his book in prison actually aligned to Nazi Germany at the time. And because of that, you've got an early audience and an early emotional connection. And his book was called My Struggle. And so he was making himself vulnerable. So when a client buys into me, what they're really doing is making themselves vulnerable because they don't know whether or not I'm going to deliver, and they're taking a risk. And we know that that's got to be the foundation principle of trust. We also know that military leaders, to Ben's point, are the most trusted because they have a formula. And that formula creates that threat and it involves that risk, but it also is about entrenching those repeat behaviours. The problem in an organisation is when an organisation is typically reactive, and we don't have to, we're not under threat. If we get a salary when we go to our job every day, we're not under threat, so we don't need to worry about whether we necessarily trust our leaders or not. Is it fair for our leaders to be demanded to be trusting as a value? And is it even a value? Because I don't think it is. I think the value is not trust. I think the value is integrity and capability and emotional connection that allows people to actually become trusted. But I don't think you can command it.
Yes. Sorry, go on. No, go on, please.
So I think as we become more view-based leaders, as we become more part of this uncertain world, as our economic situation becomes less certain, we bring that into work. We bring our personal lives into work. We also are working within organisations that are going through constant change. And so the piece around reliability is not there. The piece around integrity that is absolutely critical to trust is not necessarily there if I'm trying to answer the master but also answer the servant in the same way. And so how do we develop trust in both of those conflicted relationships that may or may not be holding information from each other? And so therefore there's this piece around transparency. And so I guess where I'm coming from is that if organisations want to engender trust as an operating model, what they really need to be doing is really kind of focusing on that transparency. And that transparency has to be about knowing who you are and how you're showing up and what your role is within that organisation, and also accepting that your role is going to change, and that's a mutual relationship. So the organisation has a part to play in that, but also so does the employee. And the employee in that relationship has to accept that that relationship will end at some point, and how it ends is down to the organisation, not to the employee. So sorry.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff there. I do have some questions from Alex and Ben, and I'll get onto those. But yeah, there's a few things that stood out. First of all, credibility and how you dress. I use that a lot. If you don't have a beard, you're probably not trustworthy when it comes to DevOps and Agile. You're on the kind of watch list. You know, if I want to talk about DevOps, I'm kind of liking Dave, Luke, and Tim. I'm not quite sure about Duncan. Don't even get me started with Ben and Mandy. So I use that a lot actually, and it works. In fact, I tell people, if somebody with a beard says it's all right, and you're talking about public clouds, you're probably fine. If they're clean shaven, they're wearing a suit, They don't know what the fuck they're talking about. So I use that. I do use that a lot, and it's incredibly useful as a shortcut. But people are slightly confused, and then.
Do they still trust
Pardon?
you though? Do they still trust you though?
Yes, they do. They're wrong to, of course, but yeah, they do. So.
But it is funny, Chris, what you're saying about, and Caroline, about the perception of your dress. It's kind of, it seems weird that that's the thing that you get hooked into.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm only being slightly tongue in cheek, because broadly speaking, and again, I won't go into the thinker thumper dialectic, which Tim and I both know, but basically. Some things, particularly in a technical arena, and I don't want to go all nerdy, but in the technical arena, it's just a cultural difference. It's a different world. The people who are the decision makers are not the technologists, and the people who are the technologists are generally not the decision makers. And really, you want the technology strategy to be decided by the technologists, but they need some help because they're not necessarily good at collaborating. The traditional leaders are generally good at the collaborating, but they're not. They don't understand intuitive. They don't have that group intuition that Ben was talking about. So that's kind of like a space. That's a liminal. Oh no, I need to take a card now. So what have I got? What wouldn't you do? Well, I'm certainly not going to say limit. Oh no, I just caught myself. No. So
recursive. So,
yeah.
If I can just chip in there. I mean, this is slightly off trust, but just. The types of people who assist with transitions across liminal spaces are often considered to be mavens, people who connect into different worlds. And I think when we look at us, we're all in that kind of category of people who look at either sides of a divide, and we're interested in those transitions. And obviously lots of other people need that. But how do people develop a competence in being able to look across multidisciplinary issues and look at things like this? So, that's maybe a topic for another.
It's tough. I mean, I think Caroline, you talked about having skin in the game. Often the people who are in the transformation game need skin in more than one game, and that is one of the things that I find difficult but necessary. As you're on mute, Caroline.
Absolutely, I've got some fireworks going off in the background, sorry, but yeah, absolutely. And I think also not only in transformation world, but as a leader, we have got multiple servants to serve. And the reality is that within those are unwritten contracts that say, if I share this information with you, you can't share it with your team. If your team share information with you, some of that can be shared within the organization, and some of it is too personal and too vulnerable. Within a coaching relationship, you also have a contract of trust. But the reality is, if that person then becomes in danger, then what's the situation? So there's different masters, I guess, that we're all serving in different roles around trust.
And this is complicated, isn't it? Because we need to be able to get on the same page with people, even if we're acting in ways that are not compatible with our personal situation. How can we get the trust that, if we need, obviously we're in a phase with COVID where there's redundancies coming along,
and that's not new. Organisations have been doing that for years, haven't they? Yeah. And so the reality is, it's about that acceptance that I don't own the position that I'm in. Somebody else has control over that position for me, and at some point I'll exit this organisation, and I'll over exit on a ball of glory, or I'll exit it because somebody's walked me out the door. But the reality is that will do with the changing times, not necessarily my own talent or my own experience. So there's an emotional opportunity for us to really connect in those situations. And if you do connect in those situations, people will pretty much move forward with what's required if they trust you to be able to do that. I guess my issue is that trust shouldn't be the goal. Being trustworthy should be the goal. And the reality is that organisations are not asking people to be trustworthy or to demonstrate skills that demonstrate trustworthiness. What they're asking for is for us all to trust. and that would require for us all to walk forward blindly. And what happens is that people revolt against that, and their behaviours change because they don't want to be part of a blindly trusting collective, even though that we might have made those decisions very early on.
Yeah, and there is a difference, isn't there, between being trusting and being blind to realities and differences and conflicts. Ben?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on something that Caroline said about transparency. This is something that I think is actually really important, that the transparency has a polarity when it comes to teams. So in Agile, we tend to, want to make all the work visible. And I think that that's antithetical to trust, because what that is basically saying to the people in power is, I don't trust you lot, I want to see what you're up to. But for leadership, I think it works the other way around. I think transparency wants to be, and this is how leadership, setting a mission in the military works, is you are always absolutely 100% clear about what the mission is and what the objective is. And that is one way of looking at transparency. So in my view, one way to increase trust in an organization, and I'll be very interested in other people's kind of take on this, is you provide transparency boundaries on the way down, so that you've got these kind of, right, you as a team, you're trusted, this is what we want from you, but go and crack on and get on with it. But you open up that transparency upwards, so that as a leader, you're expected to be completely transparent about what the goals are and what the context of why the goals exist is. And that's something that I've been sort of playing around with, as a software developer. I definitely feel like transparency is the wrong way around sometimes, and we need some abstraction boundaries. So I'd be really interested in what other people think about the interplay between trust and transparency like that.
Yeah, before we unpack that, we just got a couple of questions. So from Alex Papworth, Alex asks, how do we trust ourselves? Is there enough trust here for anyone to share a story of problems they have had with this?
Yeah, I mean, I could share many stories of both trusting myself and being unable to trust myself. And I think that's the reality, isn't it? We trust ourselves within context. So if you want me to walk into an organization and be able to identify what's wrong with the organization and what's stopping progress, I trust that that's going to come from me. I trust my intuition and my experience enough to be able to identify that solution quite quickly. And I never question that. Thank goodness I don't, because I'm paid not to. But on the other hand, if you ask me if I can trust myself, it depends on what that experience looks like. So if you look at our stress response, whether that's fight, flight, or freeze, if you put me in a situation of danger, or a situation of anger, or a situation of threat, then my stress response might be a completely out-of-body experience to what I think and how I think I would behave in the situation. And I think that's where we stop trusting ourselves. I think the challenge that we've got, and if we stop trusting ourselves, I think that can cause us real problems later on. There's another element to that, which is I had a very bad injury about 20 years ago, and it meant that I was disabled for a period of time. I couldn't walk. They didn't expect me to walk again. And that was for a good 4 years. So we're not talking a short-term injury. And within that, I lost the trust in my body. And I've never regained that. So when we're younger, and you've probably seen it a lot in the military, Ben, when you're younger, you really do think that you're invincible and that nothing can stop you from working. And as you get older, or if you have an injury, then that trust can completely disappear. And it's back to what you were saying earlier. It's not necessarily about whether we start off trusting, it's the breach of trust that then becomes the problem, because then we create a pattern out of that breach of trust. So if we've been let down before, we'll expect that to be let down again. And so again, it comes back to what can we realistically expect? If I'm going through a change program, and my change program previously has failed in this organization as a reaction to change licensed practitioner, when I'm measuring that, people will say, well, actually, no, this organization never follows through change. But what's really happened is that they never communicated the difference and where that change was going. But my synapses, and therefore what I say at the coffee machine, is don't buy into it. It will never change. It's not going to happen. Carry on regardless. and people then either get left behind or they join the journey. That's down to the power of the group and their experience. So
Great. Sorry, Caroline, we've just got another question, a question from Ben Sangwar. And Ben says, why do we trust the people we trust? A lot of the time we have no say in the matter as well. Think banks, planes, and the choice of a government.
yeah.
Well, that was a point I wanted to bring up regarding just trust in general, because we wouldn't be having this conversation without a degree of implicit trust in institutions, organizations, and there's a kind of trust that's embedded in sort of cultural evolution that allows current day functions to happen, and that's built up in layers over time. So I think, though, because we're in a phase of climate collapse and systems breakdown, the phenomena we've got politically, economically, and socially is showing that those structures aren't holding up under the complexity and the pressures we've put on the planet. So then, if the implicit trust starts to break down, what do we trust in?
Is that a good point to segue to you, Duncan, then, to
Well,
take us
there's
through your take?
certainly a point there, Dave, about the difference between trust and reliability. You know, my alarm clock is reliable, but trust is a different matter altogether. So yeah, trust is, as we've spoken about, it's more like a trust in organizations or trust in teams is like a social consensus. So when that social consensus is formed, then it can lead to emergent flow or emergent properties, if you like, and leverages the capabilities of all of the members of the team. But once it's lost, it kind of crumbles away. It can lead to betrayal. So we've spoken on betrayal, but you know, we can only be betrayed if we trust in the first place. That's the difference between reliability and trust. The idea that once somebody feels betrayed, they may take revenge, or worse, they may become an insider in terms of, let's say, cyber or other kind of antisocial behaviour at work. So you know, it's kind of there's lots of as you know, there's lots of kind of writings about trust from an academic sphere, about organizational trust and trustworthiness that Caroline mentioned, but kind of also that trust can be used as a bridge. So when we're deciding, or if we're cognitive, we might decide that somebody is reliable, predictable, capable. Therefore, if when we're thinking about trust, we kind of extend what we already know about people and situations into the future. So if we were to do X, Y, and Z, would I be able to trust or rely on that person? So trust is kind of logical. It's not magical. It is kind of have its building blocks, its background, and also there's different ways that as transformation people, because we spoke on the difficulties, and I've likewise had difficulties stepping from one group of people to another group of people and having to have credibility with both groups of people. So you can use as trust as a bridge between those two. And the kind of analogy I would give is that of a diplomat. So a diplomat is representing the home country in a foreign nation, but they're kind of have special protection and boundaries because of the trust relationship that they have with their home country. So the idea that you know, it's simply calculatable is probably not right, but in terms of the things that we can do to engender, or because trustworthiness is an attribute of the person, of a person, whereas trust is granted by the person that is going to be doing the trusting. So the trustee shows trustworthiness in order that the trustor can trust. So trust is a gift, really, from teams or other members of teams to the person that is seeking that trust position. So Yeah, it's interesting. You know, there's high levels of trust in the mafia, for instance, as well as the army, and again because they offer protection in some form or other to the people they represent, and kind of kind of institutional trust, often built, if you like, on reliability and stability. If the world is becoming more febrile or more easily moving, more liminal, we might be able to kind of ascertain that some of the loss of faith and trust, and we talked of confidence, so trust being an expectant confidence, if you like, a confident expectation. So that some of that confidence would be eroded by the fact that it's that reliability baseline is not there for those organisations anymore.
And one of the things, Duncan, that we spoke about last week, again with Dave Snowden, I don't want to just like pick on Dave, but it's another one that I mentioned, is he was talking about people trusting in narratives and identity politics. And one of the problems is that that narrative trust, because it's to do with identity, is very strongly held. And I think Dave talked about energy gradients. So, you know, and I don't know all the details, but it's basically, it's almost like a lowest common denominator. It's easier for me to buy into, I identify with this narrative, than I understand this complex argument. So therefore, given the choice, I'm going to, you know, it's less effort for my brain to buy into the narrative. So actually, one of the things that I worry about the age we live in is that a lot of the narratives that people are trusting are going to be basically going to be smashed against a wall in the next few years. And I'm assuming that a lot of the bizarre behaviors that we're seeing are going to be basically people will say, no, actually, I want to stick with the narrative. I'm happy with that. And we'll end up with these kind of people who are, you know, they're keeping those narratives alive because they trust the story because it's so ingrained, rather than trust the events as they're unfolding in front of them. Caroline.
Actually, Chris, I think you're making a very
When you think about
you're making a very topical point, because one of the observations that was being made about the US election results is that even if Trump, as we now think, doesn't succeed in a second term, because there hasn't been a landslide in the opposite direction, the legacy of divisive Trumpism will likely continue. So effectively, there's as you say, a perpetuation of a narrative that arguably has no reason to perpetuate, other than that lots of people have bought into it.
Caroline, were you going to build on that too?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting where we get our narratives from now. So AI is controlling the information we see. I can sit down with my son who's at university, and he has what we now call the university narrative against my old school, old world narrative. And his narrative is being fed all sorts of different information through social media to my narrative that's being fed by social media, and at some point we come together and decide which one's right. So the reality is that kind of narrative that we're being fed is not in our control anymore, and it's not something that we can easily decide on based on whatever information that we're giving. And I think that's really really prominent within organizations as well now. So a lot of the information that their data will be giving them will be based on data of the pre-COVID. So it'll be based on information that they had, based on information that they put into their projections and what they expect, based on the information of how their customers are going to behave. Whereas now, post-COVID, are we going to be ready for the risk of actually none of that data being intelligible anymore, or actually fitting with the business or where the business is at? And so that narrative changes as well.
So are we then captured by another trust narrative? We're captured by the narrative of like the internet companies, social media companies trust the value of their advertising model, as Jaron Lanier would. That's another Tim reference, another book Tim recommended to me that I read. You Are Not a Gadget. And is that the issue, that what we've got then is that these these trust circles exist, but they're existing in these social media platforms, and they're not. And then people that isn't, the people who are engaging in them aren't part of that inner circle, because there's that missing ingredient, which is to do with the ad revenue and things like that. There is a couple of questions. So my pronunciation is really horrible, but is it Lorenk? And Lorenk asks, I'm fascinated by Ben's comment, trust and group intuition. Can you please expand a little more on the importance of group intuition? What do you mean by this? We'll get back to you, Duncan, after that.
I think it might be my friend Lawrence.
Yeah, Lawrence.
Possibly.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Has he got a
Hox
PhD?
Halari.
Yes, that's him.
Lawrence
Yes,
doesn't say whether he has.
Hello, Lawrence.
Yeah.
Lovely to make touch with you.
Sure. So it's actually a good time to dig into this, because I think group intuition and narrative are actually really strongly linked. So, you know, to Dave Snowden's point last week, all a narrative is a cognitive hack to allow you to use a quicker intuition-based pathway in your brain, right? So you chunk up a bunch of knowledge. You say that when I see this, I can infer this larger thing, and then you use the larger thing to get a sort of cognitive leverage, if you like. And it's exactly the same mechanism, I believe, in groups. That intuition is just a shared cognitive hack for that group. So what would be a good example? Okay, I've got an example. So when I was younger, I used to work on the doors on security in Portsmouth, and I used to work in a pub, really horrible, rough pub, like most are in Portsmouth, with my brother and my best friend. And we had this group, we had this way of communicating that didn't need any words at all. We all had radios and earpieces, but we had this rapport with each other and this intuition from working together for so long, and this grounding in the scenario that we were in, that all it would take would be one of us walking through the pub and a very slight tilt of the head, and we would all immediately share this group knowledge that, oh yeah, he's talking about that dickhead over there in the shirt who's going to need to be thrown out in 5 minutes. Yeah. And that's an example of group trust breeding group intuition. I hope that's
or bias. Or
example.
is that bias? Are we really creating bias through group intuition?
Yeah. So
100% is bias, because you know, bias is very, very useful as a cognitive hack. Sometimes, you know, you can be biased against the little scrote with a tattoo on his neck, because you've seen that little scrote played out in different scenarios. But yes, you're absolutely right, Caroline. It is definitely bias.
So I'm just wondering, Duncan, with Ben's talking about cognitive hacks, trust isn't a one and done thing. It seems to me, I mean, sometimes it can be about, you know, a murder, you know, you get a double tap in the head because you've spoken to the police and things like that in the mafia circles. But trust is also, there's also a transactional element to it, and it seems to be something that is iterative. It reminds me a little bit of, you know, the iterative prisoner's dilemma and things like that. It seems to be there's a dance or a game going on as well, isn't there?
Yeah, certainly. From my research, there's kind of the idea of transactions that often build on the day-to-day of whatever it is we do, and the orderly and clean execution of transactions leads to the reliability element, to reliability trust, if you call it that. But also it's combined with a benevolence as well, so a kind of benevolent outlook that gives security to the individual. So in not only do you have to demonstrate, if you like, the iterative type of trust, you also need to give out signals, because we use signals all the time. You've got to give out signals that you are kind of, if you like, looking after or caring for that kind of individual. So it's a combination of both. And again, trust is not transactional in that if I kind of fall foul of transactions once, often I wouldn't go near that person again. But if it's relational, there's an element of, you know, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me kind of thing. That the trust it allows a little bit of leeway before the relationship becomes in difficulty. So and often again will resurface. We all know of people that have left jobs and then come back to jobs, or kind of have where trust has resurfaced and the values have realigned. So it's this idea of values, but also the value of the relationship. So value and values together.
Mm.
And does that mean that people need to keep score? Is that what the teams that are doing in, you know, Ben's bouncer teams? Are they kind of, you know, can I rely on this person? Are they maintaining a mental tally?
Yeah, very possibly. There's certainly, you know, it's this idea of externalities. You know, so closely cohesive groups or tribes often fall foul of other closely related groups of tribes, and so you know there has to be an appreciation that although these externalities exist, they don't not necessarily fitting for every situation. So yeah, there's a bit of presentation involved sometimes in the way in which these groups work.
Yeah. So it sounds like it's something that needs to be worked at. It's like going to a gym. It's not. It seems like what we're saying is it's not a right. It needs to be kind of built up from something.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
If I could
Yeah,
just,
it's kind of iterated. Yeah.
if I could just sort of chip in here, I
Sorry.
suppose, because we're whenever we have these type of discussions, we're always trying to converge on a sort of shared understanding. I suppose one of the challenges we've got here is this such a vast topic that actually there's a huge spread of, you know, different realities. And, you know, if you talk about how do you establish trust in a village in the United Kingdom that has a regional accent, well, probably unless you were born in that village, you'll never ever become, you know, fully trusted, because, you know, my mother lived in a place in North Yorkshire for, you know, 50 years before she died, and she was always going to be an outsider. I've lived in the same place 20 years, and I'm never going to be like the person next door to me who's can trace his ancestors back in the village 200 years. So, you know, there are situations where certain types of trust can't be established except, you know, by being a person having an identity that's embedded in the culture. If we look at Japanese society, you've got sort of kinship, different types of obligation, because we talked about keeping accounts, you know, giri and giru and on the different types of obligation that a Japanese person feels, you know, to the emperor and to the head of the household and to strangers. And, you know, the sense that if they don't want to receive anything from a stranger because they can never repay it, so that, you know, the sense that my sense of obligation will never end. You know, sumimasen. You know, the Japanese people have a culture which builds trust around their identity and around their language. And what we're discussing here is not going to go anywhere near really touching on some of these cultural specifics. So I suppose what we're really talking about here is we're talking about trust in the context of Western companies and, you know, the legal fiction of limited liability companies and corporations. And effectively, we're talking about trust in our own cultural context, because some of these things just won't generalize very much outside, you know, where we're coming from.
So I'm just wondering at this. Oh, sorry, go on. I'm just wondering at this point. We haven't heard from you for a while, Luke, and then Dave. Obviously, we'll get to you later on. But you know, how does this correspond to your experience and the type of things that you get involved in?
Well, it's interesting because the whole concept of narrative was mentioned, and I just want to add to that narrative is also a vehicle to transfer values, right? So there's always some values hidden in the narrative, which we then basically by suspending belief, we sort of accept the story. By accepting the story, we also accept the values hidden in that story. So if we don't believe the narratives anymore, we also reject those values. And if we reject those values, then we're also not likely to live out these values. which means we need new narratives or different narratives. So sometimes it's important to construct new narratives, maybe around old values. Maybe that's the case. But for example, the narrative of work hard, become part of the middle class, rise up in the social ladder. That's a narrative, and I think more and more people are questioning that kind of narrative, and which is problematic because it has good values embedded in it itself. So that's one thing. And the other thing about, again, the point of acting out a narrative is also important. So actually that is where I'm going to mention that term, liminal space, starts to unfold, is if a group is willing to act out on these narratives and act out these values as a group. And that's when they can experience that state. But if they reject certain narratives and reject certain values, it becomes increasingly difficult, especially if these values are not coherent anymore. So if the group doesn't believe in a common set of values and is willing to act them out as a narrative. And again, I refer back to the theater or film production or all that, where you have those spaces unfolding. That's a group of people acting out a narrative, right? That's what it is. And that's how they that's how they get into that space. So that's just on the behalf of trust, values, narratives, culture, and how important that is for any basis of trust.
So I suppose with things in flux, we probably all need to be on the stage a little bit, don't we, in our heads? We need to be able to kind of act through some new narratives and explore other stories rather than the ones that we're given either by virtue of our upbringing or the things that we end up falling into on social media.
I think there's also a piece around creating a universal value. So what does that mean when we look at, universal values are easy to achieve if we're looking at something like climate crisis, or they should be easier to achieve from that perspective, but maybe slightly more different when we're looking at religion or our faiths or our beliefs. If you look at, to use Hitler again, as a trusted leader, people really bought into his values and they bought into his way of working, whereas for us, that would now be seen as abhorrent. So how do we combine a set of universal values that we all abide by and live by, and who determines those? So when we talk about creating trust, a lot of what we're talking about at the moment is in smaller groups. And so therefore there's an agenda. So is it naive to trust, or is that trust based on an agenda to either create a bias that keeps us safe or keeps us secure or gets to the answer quicker, or a new narrative that serves us but doesn't serve everybody? And so again, this kind of universal trust in an organization becomes really important as well.
I think that's probably a good time to segue onto Mandy and get your take on trust and what you've heard so far.
Oh shit, not me. Oh, one of the discussions that we had last week, Duncan, you mentioned about how actually the cognitive load on not trusting is harder, or there's more cognitive load, whereas when you trust, it's easier. And that, and when you sort of mentioned that and talked about that really did kind of resonate with me a lot, because I'm quite I would classify myself as being quite lazy. So I would much rather trust than to be skeptical, because for me to be skeptical, it's just going to take too much of my cognitive load. So I'd rather trust until, I'm given the evidence. Then obviously it's going to be, I'll look at it again. And I think in the same manner, a lot of society where they follow a certain path, whether it be a spiritual path or a religion, they have this narrative of, well, we know we're born. The minute you're born, you're limited, because we know that death is going to be there, because death is not going to escape any of us. So that narrative of actually, within a certain society, that salvation is going to come, then it's much easier to carry on believing in that narrative. That's okay. You're getting beaten. It's okay. It's my karma. It's okay. Salvation is coming. I think, there is a generation of younger people that are saying, no, piss off, I'm not believing in that narrative. So, you know, there's, on the one hand, it's easier to sort of say, well, actually, I trust myself, so I trust you. But if I turned around and said, well, I don't trust you, then am I saying I don't trust myself? There, you know, there's so many different ways to look at it. I mean, I don't want to be suspicious all the time. Why should I be suspicious? Of course, I'm going to lock my doors. I'm going to take those sorts of measures to keep myself secure. But yeah, just from that kind of angle, I look at it and I think, well, you know, trust is basically, trust is the boundary that holds behavior and values. And I think we have to revisit those values consistently. And I think in this current like pandemic that we're going through, I think we have to encourage each other to revisit those values within that boundary so that that trust is not lost.
And Mandy, do you think it's possible to be compassionate without being trustful?
Oh God, I think one of the things is in my mind is, when I was thinking about the trust, I was thinking exactly what Caroline was saying. Actually, if somebody has trusted me to do something, and that something could be wrong, it could be like conceived as a threat, I'm going to go and do it because my trust is, you've given me that trust. You've given me that job to do something, and I'm not going to break that trust. But that could be going against, I don't know, society, or going against a value. So could you be compassionate in trust? I'm not sure. I don't know. I'm not sure what the question was. Sorry, I kind of went off on a tangent.
It's really just trying to understand: is compassion separate from trust? Can I be compassionate towards people whilst also knowing that I can't rely on them?
Can I chip in a little bit? That I really think that they are different, and because effectively compassion is not implying you're that you're necessarily going to place trust in another person or make a trust decision. But it's really around what I think again Jaron Lani has talked about as circles of empathy. So you can't have empathy for everything. If you everybody draws their empathy line somewhere, you know, do they want to not eat meat because they have empathy for animals, or do they want to eat certain types of animals but not others because they consider, you know, those animals have rights? So effectively compassion and empathy is a you know, comes in circles, but there are limits to how far your compassion can reach, but the limits as to how far compassion works, at least humans, not, I think really God's compassion can reach everybody, but you know, as a human being, you have your limited life, you have your maybe 30,000 days if you live to 80, you haven't got the ability to be compassionate for everything, so you have to make choices. But I think the way that you make compassion choices about your values and your alignment, your empathy, is not necessarily even very well correlated with your trust decisions, because your trust decisions are very much more about yourself and your identity and your commitment to a particular way of behaving and to being trustworthy. You could have compassion but still be conscious of a difference with, you know, something you cannot physically achieve, or you've rationalized that you can't achieve. And so I feel like that trust is really a different dimension. That's a personal perspective, not particularly well researched.
Sorry, go on. Was that you, Caroline?
That was me.
Oh.
Yeah. So just to build on that, actually, trust and compassion is really important. So in order to continually trust, we have to have some form of forgiveness, because we have to accept that somebody's going to fail. In order to trust in something, you have to believe and accept that you're comfortable with its risk of failure, because ultimately, otherwise you can't trust in anything at all. You also have to trust in its vulnerabilities. You have to understand that really well and to work with that, so that it's not blind trust. When I worked with domestic abuse victims, what you saw was lots of people trusting in the fact that people would change, or trusting in the fact that if they behave differently, they'd get a different outcome. Or a bit to what Mandy was just saying around, do we accept too much because we're too trusting? Are we overreaching in our trust, or are we punishing ourselves because we didn't trust in a person, or we did trust in a person and they let us down? And so that's why it's such a dangerous narrative for me to have in organizations, is that if you are looking for trusted leadership, the reality of that leadership is it's destined to fail. It's destined to let you down. It's destined to change. And so whilst you can look for authenticity, and you can look for a compassionate leader, you can look for a leader that will, where they can, be as transparent as possible, but with the acceptance that they're going to have to hold things back, they're going to have to change their direction of travel, then you've got something to trust in. But I think the challenge of the pain that trust can bring when it is breached, or where it's failed, is our own naivety that we put into that trust, and we do it again and again and again. And that can be formed by social norms, societal norms, economic norms, whatever we are kind of organized by. So if you look at a terrorist response, they're trusting in something that's higher than this world. And so therefore they have no fear in their actions, because they trust that what they're doing is right. Our perception of that might be that it's not right to do, but the reality for them is different to our reality. And so therefore, in order to trust, you have to really look at the agendas that sit behind it.
And I have no fear in actually bring us over to Dave and Luke, because we don't have that much time left. We'll go a little bit over actually, but Dave, did you want to give us your take on this topic?
Yeah, I'm really enjoying the discussion. I think everybody's making some great and very relevant points. My own background is that I worked with very difficult and challenged young adults and young people, and they had some of the biggest problems we have in society in terms of trust. So I know that on a professional level, working with people that rejected trust, and to some degree, like Caroline's pointing to, that trust has to be unconditional. So you have to give the trust and expect nothing in return. And sometimes it's responded to, and sometimes it isn't. But without that degree of trust, I don't think the growth or transformation of those young people was possible. But if we go to Luke's point about narratives, and we think that actually, what is the narrative that I personally hold, or we collectively hold for our time, this moment in time? It's an epoch. It's potentially the meltdown of an epoch, or the end of a civilization. So without some coherent narrative about our time, I think that it's difficult to trust oneself. How can one trust oneself? And when bringing this to this story, or this story of COVID as a symptom of a potential civilizational collapse, and all our stories about capitalism and trusting economics and trusting science, they're all being exploded day by day, and collective trust in those things is being watered down and challenged. And at the same time, well, then how do I trust myself? Well, I want to just bring to everybody, they've probably heard of it, but Otto Scharmer's U model, and he has 4 levels of listening. So when we were talking about the village that doesn't admit a stranger who's been there 30 years, there's a sort of downloading. That's automatic. I'm listening to the automatic story of who I think I am and who I think other people are. And I'm not going to let any other evidence change my story. So that's a kind of automatic download. So if you think you know something and you know it well, it's difficult to let go of that story. So that's a level of listening. And a second level of listening is being able to change your mind, hear different data, hear different opinions, hear new evidence, and think, okay, there might be something there, and I can alter my opinion and alter my approach, alter my strategy or my science. All science is based on that kind of what's the disconfirmation, and how can I align what I'm doing with the actual practical evidence. Then if you go the level further down in terms of listening or is empathy. So we've talked a lot about how being empathic and having a trusted interpersonal relationship with somebody. So you could say in an example, this would be in coaching or personal coaching, like some of the people on the call are, and you're able to walk in the shoes of that person. And then the fourth level is a transformative level, where you enter into a liminal space or a space of openness. So in that space of openness, transformation becomes possible, and it's co-created together. There's no coach, there's no coachee. It's both created. The new reality is created together. So in terms of trusting ourselves, I think until we can trust that deeper part of ourself that is anchored below the cultural iceberg, which we're informing, the hidden sort of blind spot of leadership, as Otto calls it, until we're informed by that, we're not going to be able to trust that much. And in the coming conditions, the life conditions, it's actually causing for an unprecedented leap of trust, a leap forward to a different level. So, and I think that leap forward comes from that the deepest level of trust. So, is
that trust, or is that almost courage in a way?
It could be both. I think if I was to simplify it, is can we trust the life process? Can we listen to the systems of the earth? Can we listen to ourselves, like the man that climbed the mast, like the people working closely together? They had a deeper trust. Okay, we have noticed that there's membranes around those envelopes of trust that maybe don't extend further, but somehow as a collective of people that can make a change, I think that membrane has to be extended as far as possible, and that's through trusting life and trusting that we can create make a new story. So that's my take on trust.
That's pretty interesting. I'm fairly new to Theory U. Valerie Freitas has very helpfully said there's a free MIT course on ULab based on Theory U. So if anybody wants to find out
I'm running
about
double that course at this moment. So
yeah, I mean that sort of, I suppose what we're there, it's starting to get back then to the the need for a new narrative, isn't it? The devices, the zero-sum game narratives that we seem to like quite a lot. They don't seem to be faring very well in the face of VUCA at all, do they?
No.
So they're toast, but they're going to take a while to die off. So it's a matter of trying to work out what the green shoots are in terms of more narrative forms. So hopefully, Luke, you can tell us a little bit about that.
Maybe. I was just going to add, I think Dave and Duncan both made some excellent points there in terms of disappointment and betrayal, which is sort of the darker side of trust and values, which is even if you come in with the best intentions, let's say as a manager, as a leader, as in some sort of position of influence, and you have the highest values and you project them into the world and they get co-created and something emerges out of that and it's all wonderful. The strangest thing happens, which is you will always find some resistance and some betrayal, and some people just don't share your set of values. It always happens. It's like gravity. Like it's just going to happen. So I think in terms of leadership education, it's good to emphasize the importance of values and trust and culture, but always raise a little bit of concern and say, listen, what's also going to happen, you will be betrayed along the line, and there is going to be resistance, and there are going to be people who don't share your point of the world, and that's going to be interesting for you. How are you going to deal with that? Because you will see that as a betrayal of your trustworthiness, right? And it's going to hurt you, and it's going to, it's going to keep you awake at night. And it's going to put you in crisis, and that's going to be an interesting time for you. So I think this is an interesting flip side of the whole topic where, I talked a lot to that with managers who I then say, don't worry, it happens to everybody, but this is interesting. Now we have something to work with. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I mean, my experience with some of my more sort of day job IT things is that often it's a matter of people think they're being betrayed, but basically it's just a lack of empathy on both sides. It's really, they haven't really understood that people are trying to act rationally, but they're playing a slightly different game. So it's often, Ben.
Sorry, I didn't realise that you hadn't quite finished talking. So empathy. I've been turning this over a little bit in my mind. I think I actually want to push back a little bit on empathy requiring trust. I think you can be completely empathetic to somebody without trusting them an inch. And you can be completely empathetic with somebody but still at the same time maintain that they are your mortal enemy and that you want to destroy them. And I think, also there's a few times this conversation's veered a little bit into the kind of the dark side of trust, which is coercion, like hacking somebody's trust to lead them down a road that is against their best interest. So, for example, extremists preying on young, vulnerable people and finding chinks in their armor and using a kind of cascading sort of building of a fake type of trust in order to manipulate them into doing things that they would never consider doing if you jump them from A straight to Z, but by dripping
which
into
is very
this
much
kind of
narrative
trust.
based in that case as well, isn't it? It's really what we're seeing is these foundational narratives that we all need to as effectively shortcuts to allow us to live a life. They've all got a dark side, surely.
It's also about trust being about dependency in order to create and leverage behavioral control. So what you're really doing is creating some codependency based on people's vulnerabilities in order that they'll take risks they wouldn't otherwise take.
Would we be better than, I mean, Duncan, would we be better in a high empathy, low trust world? You're on mute.
Yes, that was me just gathering breath. So yes, high empathy, low trust. Well, certainly, there is a point at which trust no longer becomes trust. The fact that you have to trust but verify denotes that there may be something amiss in those relationships. There's kind of a history, if you like, of kind of people who've trusted the wrong person. I'm sure we've all done that at some point. And where does this lead to the kind of moral hazard where we get onto these roundabouts that we can't get off? We need to, if you like, break the cognitive laziness, the cognitive bond that binds us, because what they do say is that trust binds and blinds people to one another. So we need to know that sometimes trust breaking is necessary. Sometimes it's necessary for the new start or the kind of transformation itself as well. So but on the other hand, we also bank a lot of trust that we never use. I know of lots of people that I do potentially trust, but I've never actually made myself vulnerable to them. So there are always other options, I think, is where we might go with this, that through our sympathies and empathies with other people, we can forge new bonds from which to carry out another path. I think part of it is, again, this cognitive laziness that I think it was Tversky and Kahneman that said that people would rather have less of this or less of that than they would have uncertainty. Possibly, the trust gives that certainty or that illusion of certainty, and stepping away from that makes us feel insecure. So yes, there's certainly a place for empathy and trust to coexist.
Which kind of goes to that shortcut point again, doesn't it? So, Dave, you're mute.
I'm not responding to Duncan's point, but Ben's point about this group intuition. I've experienced that to some degree, not in the army or anything really focused, with a focused mission in hazard. But if we look at the extraordinary performing teams like the Lakers of the 80s or 90s, or the Chicago Bulls or Barcelona or whatever, there seems to be something happening that is more than the sum of any individual, and it's more than the sum of any one individual's gifts. So there's something untapped in the kind of social sphere that is possible for humans to tap into and manifest extraordinary results if we tap into that field. So that, because I've had an experience of that, I've got a faith that changes are possible because of the extraordinary nature of that, where there's a kind of listening to the body and listening to the system that it exceeds. If you read Wilf Chamberlain's description of his performance, it was like, you know, he was struggling, he was in pain, but at the same time, he was outside and beyond it all because of the way that the team were performing in this extended social body. So that's what I feel trust in the possibility of that potential being revolutionary for humankind.
Yeah, so it's something that maybe is innate and we just need to be able to recreate it, stimulate it, get back to it, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, do the training.
Yeah, we need to do the 5 a.m. press ups.
Don't forget the cold water.
Yeah. Luke, did you want to kind of maybe have a little bit of a summing up of what you've heard and your take on it? Because we should probably finish in the next 5 minutes because we're a bit over.
I'll try. I'll try my best to summarize a very, very rich discussion we had today. I like the idea of this field which opens up when you have enough trust. I like the idea that we looked at it from different angles, from the danger of trusting the wrong people or the wrong ideas, or being lured into trust, or perhaps also being disappointed by the ambition to be trustworthy and maybe not receiving the trust which you think you deserve. So I think it's good that we looked at all sorts of aspects, also institutions. Why do we trust them? Maybe why there is now a lack of trust within these institutions. What narratives are needed to foster trust. And I think Tim actually started with a narrative today, which is interesting. So a story about the lack of trust. So I can't really encapsulate all the conversation, but I felt it went pretty much into all sorts of spaces and places, which I'm sure we could even explore more if we had more time.
Yeah, thank you. I think the lesson of these sessions is that this transformational topic is pretty large, isn't it? And I do appreciate, particularly for people listening, that there's a lot of material here. So the idea is that maybe the first series, 10 or 11 episodes, will just kind of blow the covers off this thing, and then subsequently we'll kind of drill down into things that are a bit more kind of focused, if that's possible. So I think that's probably quite a nice way of doing it, because it kind of, you know, gets the energy up. But it's certainly a fascinating topic, and I think one thing is clear: we almost need to reconnect with a lot of these sorts of these modes of operation, but probably, I mean, my take is maybe under some new foundational narratives, because the narratives that we're using probably, you know, getting past their sell-by date. So that's pretty much all we've got time for. I let it run over because it was a fascinating conversation. If I wasn't so hungry, I would have let it go on another 30 minutes, but I am. And I'm going to try and read, because it's quite hard to improvise everything. So I'd like to just thank Dave Pendle, Mandy Sunner, Duncan Greaves, Luke McBain, Ben Ford, Tim Williams, Caroline Griffiths. Thank you for everybody for watching, both on Google, YouTube and Periscope. We're probably just going to go forward with YouTube in the future. So thank you for everybody. I will put the link in the chat to next week's show, which I think Sam and some others are going to organise. Next week's show is going to be, thank you, Val, for being very kind about the show. I put the meetup link, but basically next week's show is the pyramid of transformation: accessibility, kindness, and need. So that will be the same time next week. We're going to be here every week, probably a little bit of a gap for Christmas. So I'd just like to, thank everybody again. Thank you, StreamYard, for the platform. I've been your host, Chris Patton. Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Goodbye.
And everyone else.